The bedroom door opened sometime after 3 in the morning. Terrance Yancey would later tell a jury that he had been asleep when it happened. He said the door suddenly came open and a figure moved into the room with one hand raised. In that instant, he said, he did not know who the person was. He believed he was in danger. Autumn Anderson remembered those first seconds differently. She testified that she woke to gunfire. When she looked up, she saw Yancey on the bed with a handgun, firing toward the doorway. The person in that doorway was Tyrie Richardson, her former boyfriend, the father of her child, 20 years old. Tyrie was unarmed. Yancey fired all 16 rounds in the magazine. By the time police arrived, Tyrie was on the floor beside the bed. Yancey had left the house, and only 7 days earlier, Tyrie and Autumn had still been living there together. 7 days. That is how little time separated their breakup from the shooting. Prosecutors would later say Tyrie returned to the house that morning because he wanted to reconcile with Autumn, but when the case finally reached a jury, nobody had to prove who fired the gun. Yancey admitted that. The question was, what those 16 shots meant under the law. Was this murder? Was it self-defense? Or had something happened in those few seconds that placed the killing somewhere between the two? The answer would depend on a relationship that had already lasted for years. It would also depend on another relationship that never completely disappeared, and a bedroom scene the surviving witnesses could not describe in exactly the same way. And after 7 days of trial, the jury reached a result that many people following the case would struggle to understand. Terrance Yancey was acquitted of murder. To understand how they got there, you have to know who Tyrie was before his name appeared in a court opinion. Tyrie Richardson was born on April 26, 2002. He grew up in Maryland in a large family. His obituary would later list parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles and cousins. By the time he was 20, there was one more person at the center of his life, his son, Cody. There was also another name attached to Tyrie, FSO Gunk. That was the name he used for music. His releases show that he had been recording before his death, putting out music while he was still very young. An EP appeared under the FSO Gunk name in 2020. More songs followed. One of the releases from 2021, Moment of Clarity, credits Tyrie Richardson as the songwriter. That matters for a simple reason. The Homicide did not create FSO Gunk. Tyrie had already been trying to build something. The music was part of his life before the case, and after his death, it became one of the things that remained. A later album, released under his artist name, included tracks connected to his son. Those songs do not explain the shooting. They are not evidence of what happened in that house, and there is no reason to treat lyrics like prophecy. They tell us something more basic. Tyrie had plans that existed outside a courtroom. He was making music. He was raising a child. He was still at an age when most people's adult lives have barely started taking shape. That is easy to lose once a homicide becomes public. The victim starts disappearing behind the mechanics of the crime. The shooter gets a defense. The witnesses get cross-examined. Experts get asked where everyone was standing. Lawyers debate definitions. And the person who died becomes a location on a diagram. Tyrie was more than that. He was also part of a relationship that had followed him from adolescence into fatherhood. He and Autumn Anderson met when they were around 14. They began dating in 2018. The relationship was on and off. They broke up. They got back together, then separated again. That history matters because by June 2022, a breakup between Tyrie and Autumn did not automatically mean that either of them believed the relationship could never be repaired. They had repaired it before. During one of their separations, in the summer of 2019, Autumn met another young man, Terrance Yancey. She and Yancey became romantically involved. So Yancey was not someone who suddenly appeared during the last week of Tyree's life. He had been part of Autumn's history for years. By the end of that summer, Tyree reached out to Autumn again. They reconciled. According to the later court record, Autumn continued talking with Yancey for a period after she and Tyree got back together. That communication stopped around January 2020. Then Tyree and Autumn moved forward. In March 2020, Autumn moved in with Tyree and his parents. She became pregnant. Their son was born in January 2021. By then, 2 teenagers who had met at 14 had become parents. And once Cody was there, every breakup between Tyree and Autumn came with another layer. They could stop being boyfriend and girlfriend. They could not stop being his parents. There would still be calls, pickups, drop-offs, schedules, questions about where Cody would sleep, questions about who would have him on which day. That connection is one of the most important things to understand about the final week. Because when Tyree moved out, he did not vanish from Autumn's life. He couldn't. They shared a child. By November 2021, Tyree, Autumn, and Cody had moved into a townhouse in Crofton. Later, they moved again, this time into Autumn's mother's house, on Lakeside Court in Dunkirk, Maryland. Autumn's sister, Jacy, lived there too. The house matters because of the way Tyree entered it on the morning he died. Tyree and Autumn did not use separate keys in the ordinary sense. The home could be accessed with a door code. Tyree knew that code because he had been living there. And when the relationship finally broke apart in June, he did not remove every part of his life from the house. Some of his clothes were still there. Some of his shoes were still there. That does not tell us what he was entitled to do legally when he returned. It does tell us something practical. 7 days after moving out, Lakeside Court was still a place Tyree knew well enough to enter without asking someone to unlock the front door for him. The final breakup began on June 6, 2022. Tyree discovered that Autumn had been communicating with Terrance Yancey again. The court record does not require us to guess what that discovery felt like. We know what Tyree did next. He moved out. He went back to his parents' home. Autumn and Tyree agreed to share time with Cody, passing their son between them every 5 days. So the romantic relationship had fractured, but the parenting relationship continued immediately. This is where the timeline becomes important. June 6th, Tyree leaves. June 12th. 6 days later, Autumn comes to pick up Cody. June 13. Tyree is dead. The entire final chapter of the relationship fits inside 1 week. And that compressed timing helps explain why the later claim that Tyree was trying to reconcile did not come out of nowhere. He and Autumn had separated before. They had reunited before. Their belongings and parenting responsibilities were still intertwined. Nothing about that means a reconciliation was guaranteed. It means the separation was fresh. On Sunday, June 12, Autumn picked up Cody from Tyree's home because their son was going to Florida with Autumn's mother. Tyree and Autumn stayed in contact that day through Instagram. The messages described in the court record were about Cody, his schedule, how Tyree could contact Autumn's mother while the child was away. The conversation sounds almost painfully ordinary when you know what came later. 2 parents talking about their son. No dramatic final declaration. No documented threat in those messages. No obvious clue that before sunrise, one of them would be standing in a bedroom while the other lay dying on the floor. This is one reason the last ordinary day matters. True crime is often edited backward. Once we know the ending, we start looking for signs that everybody involved should have recognized. But people do not live backward. On June 12th, Tyree did not know he had less than a day left. Autumn did not know her bedroom would become a crime scene. and the people inside Lakeside Court that evening did not know investigators would later reconstruct their movements by the minute. Sometime between 10 and 11 that night, Autumn picked up Terrance Yancey. She brought him back to Lakeside Court. Autumn's sister Jacy was there. So was Jacy's friend Chad. The four of them spent several hours together. They ate. They talked. They watched a movie. Nothing in the later court opinion describes that stretch of the night as violent or chaotic. At 2:47 in the morning, Autumn and Yancey went upstairs to Autumn's bedroom. According to the record, they went to sleep. That time is worth remembering. 2:47. Because police would be at that house before the morning had properly begun. At some point after Autumn and Yancey went upstairs, Tyrie arrived. The available appellate record does not give us a complete, minute-by-minute account of every communication that led him there. It does not tell us every thought Tyrie had before he entered. We should not invent those missing pieces. What we do have is the prosecution's position. The Calvert County State's Attorney later said, the evidence showed that Tyrie entered the home in the early morning hours to attempt a reconciliation with his ex-girlfriend. That is the basis for saying he came back hoping to fix things with Autumn. It is a prosecution-supported account, not mind-reading. And if you look at the 7 days before the shooting, the idea is not difficult to understand. Tyrie had moved out less than a week earlier. He and Autumn had a long history of breaking up and reuniting. They shared a son. His belongings were still in the house. They had communicated that same day. He knew the door code. Sometime after 3 in the morning, Tyrie used his familiarity with the home and went inside. Then he went upstairs. Before we go any further, hold one question in your mind. If you were hearing this case without knowing the verdict, would the fact that Tyrie entered a bedroom after 3 in the morning make self-defense possible in your mind? Do not answer based on the number of shots yet. Just remember your first reaction. The jury eventually had to separate two things that are easy to merge when we hear a story after the fact. Why did Tyrie come to the house? And what did Yancey believe in the first seconds after Tyrie entered the room? Those are not the same question. Tyrie reached Autumn's bedroom. Then the door opened. From here, the case splits. Autumn's account begins after the gunfire had already started. She testified that she woke to shots. When she looked toward the doorway, she saw Tyrie standing there. Yancey was on the bed with a black handgun. He was firing. Autumn saw Tyrie fall. The court's later summary of the evidence states that Tyrie did not have a weapon. That fact would remain important from the investigation all the way through the trial. But Autumn had a limitation as a witness. She had been asleep when the encounter began. At one point in the immediate aftermath, she described Tyrie as having burst into the room. At trial, she acknowledged that because she had been sleeping, she did not actually see the exact way he first came through the door. That left the opening instant largely to Yancey's account, and Yancey's account was the foundation of his defense. He testified that he was lying in bed with Autumn when the bedroom door suddenly burst open. He saw a figure enter. He described the person as shadowy. He said the figure came toward him quickly, with a hand raised. Yancey said he moved backward. There was a handgun beneath the pillow. He grabbed it, and he fired. Not once, not twice. All 16 rounds in the magazine. According to Yancey, he began firing while he was low on the bed, sitting against the wall. As the shooting continued, he said, he moved upward until he was standing. Autumn was behind him. Yancey also made a claim that would be difficult for many people to accept without scrutiny. He said he did not realize the person he had shot was Tyrie until after the gunfire ended. He knew who Tyrie was. That was not disputed. His argument was narrower. In the darkness and sudden movement of that moment, he said, He could not identify the person coming through the door before he reacted. Whether that was true became one of the central questions in the case. Because if Yancey recognized Tyrie immediately, then the jury would evaluate his fear with that knowledge in mind. If he genuinely believed an unknown intruder had entered a bedroom in the middle of the night, the legal analysis could look different. That is why the first few seconds mattered so much, and it is also why the physical evidence inside the room would later receive so much attention. The two surviving witnesses could describe what they remembered. The bedroom could not speak, but it could leave measurements. Immediately after the shooting, Autumn ran out of the bedroom. She went to her sister and told Yancey to call police. Yancey came through the hallway soon afterward. Autumn testified that he went downstairs, struggled with his things and asked where his phone was. He eventually left the house carrying his clothes and wearing some of Autumn's sleepwear. Inside the bedroom, Tyrie needed help. Yancey called 911. The operator tried to get a clear picture of what had happened while emergency crews were already being sent toward Lakeside Court. Was Tyrie awake? Was he breathing? Where was the shooter? Could anyone safely approach him? Autumn and Yancey did not know whether Yancey might come back. The operator instructed them to begin CPR. That meant Tyrie's body was moved before crime scene technicians could document its original position. At first, that seems like a minor detail. It was not. Months later, lawyers would argue about the position of Tyrie's body during the shooting. The fact that two people had moved him while trying to save his life became part of the forensic debate. The first deputy arrived within minutes. Tyrie was lying between the bed and the wall, with his head oriented toward the bedroom opening. The deputy checked him. There was no pulse. Tyrie Richardson was pronounced dead inside a house where, 1 week earlier, he had still been living with Autumn and their child. The officer's next problem was immediate. Where was the shooter? Deputies searched the house. Yancey was not there. Other officers began looking around the property and surrounding area. What had started as a domestic scene inside one bedroom now expanded into a search across Dunkirk. Authorities warned residents, while multiple law enforcement resources looked for Yancey. K9 teams were involved. Nearby agencies assisted. Police knew the person they were searching for had just left a fatal shooting. They also had reason to believe the handgun might still be with him. The identity question was simple. The location question was not. Yancey's later testimony described a chaotic flight. He said that after leaving the house, he realized he did not have shoes. The door had locked behind him. He heard sirens coming closer. He ran through yards. He hid, and at some point during that period, he threw the handgun into a wooded area. That action would eventually matter on its own. Removing the weapon did not answer whether the first shot had been fired in self-defense. But prosecutors could ask why a man who believed he had lawfully defended himself would leave the scene and get rid of the gun. The defense could answer that people panic. The jury would have to decide what weight to give it. Yancey remained at large through the day. By that evening, a resident named Christopher Wilson encountered a man near his home. The man asked to use a phone. Wilson later identified him as Yancey. According to Wilson's testimony, Yancey gave him a story about having been robbed and carjacked. Wilson had already heard enough about the police search to become suspicious. He contacted law enforcement without openly confronting the man at his door. Wilson later testified that he noticed a shape under Yancey's clothing that he thought looked like a handgun. That observation would become controversial later because the actual gun from the shooting had, according to Yancey's testimony, already been discarded in the woods. The defense challenged whether Wilson should have been allowed to give that kind of opinion. At the time, though, Wilson had a simpler concern. He wanted police there. Yancey did not stay. He left before officers could take him into custody at the house. Several hours later, early on June 14th, police found him. Almost a full day had passed since the shooting. Yancey was arrested. The manhunt was over. But finding him did not solve the case in the ordinary sense. There was no mystery suspect to identify, no DNA match waiting to name the shooter, no confession needed to establish that Yancey had fired the weapon. He acknowledged the shooting. From that point forward, the case would turn on classification. What kind of homicide was this? That is a much more difficult question than it sounds. A person can intentionally fire a gun and cause a death without every homicide law applying in the same way. The law cares about intent. It cares about premeditation. It cares about provocation. It cares about whether the person believed force was necessary. It cares whether that belief was reasonable. And in a self-defense case, the same physical act can be treated very differently, depending on what the jury believes about the seconds before it happened. That meant investigators needed more than 16 casings and a dead body. They needed to understand the room. Crime scene technician Kelsey Ward arrived at Lakeside Court in the early morning hours. By then, the emergency response had given way to documentation. Ward photographed the bedroom before disturbing evidence. She documented cartridge casings, bullets, damage to the walls, marks where rounds had struck or passed through surfaces. 16 cartridge casings were recovered. That number matched Yancey's account of emptying the magazine. But counting the casings was the easy part. The harder work was trying to understand where the gun had been as different rounds were fired. Investigators found several defects in the walls. Some could be used for trajectory analysis. Others could not. A bullet that passes cleanly through a surface can leave a path that helps estimate direction. A bullet that ricochets or deforms may tell you much less. Ward used trajectory rods in the usable defects. She also used a Faro laser scanner to create a three-dimensional digital record of the room. The technology can look almost definitive when you see it on a screen. Lines running through a digital bedroom, angles converging, positions plotted. But the science has limits, and Ward acknowledged them. Of the wall defects examined, 5 produced trajectories that could be meaningfully reconstructed. 3 of those lines moved upward from a lower general area behind the bed, opposite the doorway. Another moved downward from a higher elevation. A 5th came downward from nearer the center of the bed. In plain language, the gun was not necessarily being fired from exactly one height or one place throughout the sequence. There appears to have been movement. That matters because movement was part of Yancey's account. He said he began low on the bed and gradually stood while firing. Autumn, who woke after the shooting had started, remembered seeing him upright on the bed. Those 2 statements can sound contradictory when reduced to one sentence each. The trajectory evidence made the sequence less simple. It did not prove Yancey's story. It showed that shots came from different elevations. That is not the same thing. Ward could not tell jurors where Yancey's feet were for every shot. She could not establish the exact position of his whole body from a bullet path. She could not put the 5 reconstructed trajectories into chronological order. That last limitation is especially important. Imagine having 5 frames from a 16-frame sequence, but no timestamps on them. You know several positions existed. You do not know which came first. So when the prosecution used the trajectories to talk about movement, the defense had room to challenge how much could truly be inferred. And there was another piece of evidence that drew attention: the bottom of Tyree's sock. Ward documented bloodstaining there that she interpreted as consistent with impact spatter. Why would blood on the sole of a sock matter? Because for blood to reach the bottom of a foot in that way, The foot has to be oriented so the sole is exposed toward the source. Ward testified that the position could be consistent with Tyrie kneeling, sitting, or being in some other posture where the bottom of the foot was turned upward. Notice the word could. The evidence did not prove Tyrie was kneeling. It did not prove he was retreating. It did not prove he was advancing. It did not tell the jury whether the stain appeared after the first shot or much later in the sequence. And Tyrie's body had been moved during CPR. All of those limits mattered. This is where good forensic evidence can actually make a case more complicated. It narrows possibilities without necessarily choosing one story for you. The state could say the blood and trajectories helped reconstruct a shooting that changed position as it continued. The defense could say that movement was exactly what Yancey had described. Neither side could point to the room and say, "Here is a perfect replay." There wasn't one, and that uncertainty became important because the legal issue did not depend only on where the gun was. It depended on what Yancey believed. By the time the case went to trial, in April 2023, the state had built a large presentation. The trial lasted 7 days. Prosecutors called 19 witnesses and presented more than 300 pieces of physical evidence. Numbers like that can sound impressive, but a trial is not won by counting exhibits. Most of those pieces supported or documented parts of the story. Only a smaller number went directly to the central dispute. What happened when Tyrie entered the room? What did Yancey see? What did he believe? And even if he was afraid, how much force was legally justified? The prosecution had several facts working in its favor. Tyrie was unarmed. 16 rounds were fired. Yancey left the house. He discarded the handgun. He hid from police. A neighbor testified that Yancey claimed he had been robbed or carjacked, rather than saying he had just defended himself in a shooting. Those facts could make Yancey's later claim of lawful self-defense harder to accept. But the defense wanted jurors to separate the aftermath from the beginning. They wanted the jury back in the bedroom before anyone had run, before anyone had discarded a gun, before any police officer arrived. Yancey was an invited guest. He had gone upstairs with Autumn. He was asleep. According to him, the bedroom door suddenly came open and a figure moved toward him. He said he saw a raised hand. He said he could not identify the person. He said he believed he was in immediate danger. That was the moment the defense wanted judged. An unarmed person can still be part of a self-defense claim. Self-defense law does not require the other person to have a gun. The question is whether the defendant actually believed he faced imminent death or serious bodily harm, and whether that belief was reasonable under the circumstances. An unarmed person can, in some situations, pose that level of threat. But the absence of a weapon still matters. Jurors could consider it when deciding how reasonable Yancey's fear was, and whether 16 shots represented force beyond what the situation required. Maryland law gave the jury several possible paths. The first was complete self-defense. For that to apply, Yancey needed an actual belief that he was in immediate or imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. That belief also had to be reasonable. He could not be the aggressor, and the force used could not exceed what he reasonably believed was necessary. If the jury accepted complete self-defense, the homicide could be justified. Then there was partial or imperfect self-defense. This is the part that later became essential to understanding the verdict. Suppose Yancey truly believed the person entering the room was about to kill or seriously harm him. But suppose that belief was not reasonable. The fear could still be genuine. The law would not completely excuse the killing. Or suppose he genuinely believed some force was necessary, but used more deadly force than a reasonable person would have considered necessary. Again, that could prevent complete self-defense without automatically leaving murder as the only option. Under the instructions given in this case, imperfect self-defense could reduce murder to voluntary manslaughter. There was also a defense connected to the home itself. Yancey had been invited into Lakeside Court. The jury was instructed about defense of habitation and about circumstances involving an intruder who posed an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. That brought the strange status of the house back into focus. Tyrie had lived there until 7 days earlier. He knew the access code. His belongings remained inside. But Yancey was there with Autumn's permission that night. The law had to deal with the situation as it existed in those moments, not as a simple story about a homeowner and a burglar. The defense also wanted a separate mistake of fact instruction. Their theory was easy to understand. Yancey said he mistook Tyrie for an unknown intruder. If that mistake was reasonable, his attorneys argued, the jury should be told how it affected criminal responsibility. The trial judge declined to give a separate instruction. The court's reasoning was that the self-defense and defense of habitation instructions already required jurors to confront the same underlying issue. What did Yancey believe he was facing? And was that belief reasonable? That ruling would become one of the issues Yancey challenged on appeal. At trial, though, the jury first had to hear from Yancey himself. He took the stand. That decision exposed his version to direct examination and then to cross-examination. He described lying in bed, the door opening, the figure, the raised hand, his fear, the gun under the pillow, the shooting. He also described moving as he fired, beginning lower on the bed and eventually standing. The physical evidence gave the defense something to work with, because several reconstructed trajectories originated at different elevations. But it did not certify his account. No trajectory could say, Yancey was afraid here. No blood pattern could say, Tyrie intended to attack here. Those are human questions. The jury had to infer them from conduct, testimony, and circumstances. The state had its own way of framing the same evidence. Tyrie came into a house he had recently called home. According to prosecutors, he wanted to reconcile with the mother of his child. He was unarmed. Yancey fired 16 rounds. Then Yancey ran and got rid of the gun. For prosecutors, that sequence was not a reasonable defensive response. For the defense, the number of shots could not be judged without remembering how quickly a frightened person can react in a confined room. That is the tension at the center of this case, and it is worth asking the question now, before the verdict. If you were on that jury, where would you draw the line? Would the sudden entry into a bedroom after 3 a.m. make Yancey's fear reasonable? Would Tyrie being unarmed change your answer? Would 16 shots? Would Yancey's decision to run afterward change how you interpreted what he said happened before he ran? There is no need to force an answer yet. The jury had days of evidence to work through. So did the lawyers. One of the trial's more unusual disputes involved the 911 call. The defense objected to the recording because Autumn could be heard in the background in an extremely emotional state. Their concern was prejudice. A jury hearing a terrified, grieving person immediately after a shooting may react to the emotion before weighing what the recording actually proves. The state argued that the call had legitimate value. It documented the immediate aftermath. It explained the CPR instructions and why Tyrie's body was moved. And it gave the jury context for Autumn's condition at a time when her credibility and behavior after the shooting were being challenged. The judge allowed the recording. Body camera audio from officers at the scene was also admitted. Those decisions later survived appellate review. The neighbor's testimony created another dispute. Christopher Wilson had said that when he encountered Yancey during the manhunt, he saw a shape under Yancey's clothing that looked to him like a handgun. The defense argued that Wilson was offering an improper opinion. The state treated it as an ordinary observation from a person describing what he thought he saw. That issue also went up on appeal. These fights may sound secondary compared with 16 shots in a bedroom. Legally, they matter because criminal trials are built from layers. The jury does not hear only the central event. They hear the circumstances around it. Then the judge decides which parts are proper evidence and how those parts can be used. And in Yancey's case, the defense would later argue that several of those rulings collectively made the trial unfair. Before any appeal, though, came the verdict. The jury had several homicide possibilities in front of it. First-degree murder would have required the state to satisfy the legal elements for that offense, beyond a reasonable doubt. Second-degree murder was also available. Voluntary manslaughter was available, and complete self-defense could remove criminal liability for the homicide. The jurors had to decide where the evidence fit. That is where the case stopped being a simple story about the number 16. Because 16 is emotionally powerful. It tells you the scale of the gunfire. It does not, by itself, tell you which legal category the jury must choose. On April 17, 2023, the jurors returned. First-degree murder, not guilty. Second-degree murder, not guilty. Voluntary manslaughter, guilty. The same jury also found Yancey guilty of firearm offenses, 4 counts of reckless endangerment, and a charge related to altering physical evidence by removing the handgun. The murder charges were gone. The homicide conviction remained. That outcome is the reason this case deserves more than a headline. A jury heard that an unarmed 20-year-old had entered the room. They heard that Yancey fired 16 rounds. They heard Autumn's account. They heard Yancey's account. They saw the forensic evidence. They heard about the flight and the discarded weapon. And after all of that, they did not find Yancey completely justified. But they also did not convict him of murder. We should be careful not to claim that we know exactly what happened inside the jury room. We don't. The jurors did not issue a written explanation assigning each fact a specific weight. Maryland law gave them a path to voluntary manslaughter if they found an actual but unreasonable belief in the need for deadly force. The same was true if the force used was unreasonable despite a genuine belief that force was necessary. The verdict is compatible with that legal framework. It does not prove which exact sentence from Yancey's testimony every juror accepted. That distinction matters. Online discussion often turns verdicts into psychological certainty. The jury believed him. The jury knew he was lying. The jury said it was self-defense. None of those statements accurately captures what happened here. The jury convicted him of an unlawful homicide. They simply did not convict him of murder. So let me ask you the question that sits at the center of the case. Do you think the jury got that distinction right? Not whether Tyrie deserved to die. He did not. The question is narrower. Based on the evidence and the competing accounts, should Yancey have been convicted of murder, or does voluntary manslaughter fit the uncertainty inside that bedroom? That is the point in this case where reasonable viewers can genuinely disagree. And that disagreement is not a failure to understand the evidence. It is the same difficulty the legal system had to resolve. 3 months later, Yancey returned to court for sentencing. On July 28, 2023, Judge Mark Chandley sentenced him to 18 years of active incarceration. The state's attorney's office later emphasized that voluntary manslaughter is treated as a crime of violence under Maryland law. Prosecutors said Yancey would have to serve at least half of the active sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For some people, 18 years beside the number 16 looked almost impossible to accept. 16 rounds, 18 years. Tyrie was 20. His son was still very young. Those numbers sit next to one another in a way that naturally produces anger. But sentencing follows the convictions that survive the jury process. Yancey was not being sentenced for first-degree murder. He had been acquitted of it. He was not being sentenced for second-degree murder. He had been acquitted of that too. The central homicide conviction was voluntary manslaughter. The verdict defined the legal ceiling of what the judge was dealing with. And Yancey was not done challenging the case. He appealed. His attorneys raised several issues. They challenged parts of the crime scene technician's testimony about trajectories and positions. They challenged Wilson's observation about what he believed looked like a handgun under Yancey's clothing. They challenged the admission of the 911 recording and body camera audio. And they argued again that the jury should have received a separate mistake of fact instruction. That last issue went straight back to the doorway. If Yancey truly mistook Tyrie for an unknown intruder, his attorneys wanted that mistake addressed explicitly. The Appellate Court of Maryland disagreed that a separate instruction was necessary. In October 2025, it affirmed the convictions. The court concluded that the self-defense and defense of habitation instructions already required jurors to consider the substance of Yancey's claimed mistake. If his belief in danger was actual and reasonable, complete self-defense was available. If it was actual but unreasonable, the instructions allowed the jury to consider partial self-defense. The appellate court also rejected Yancey's other claims of reversible error. He sought further review. On January 28, 2026, the Supreme Court of Maryland denied his petition for certiorari. That did not mean the state's highest court wrote a new opinion, agreeing with every detail of the lower court's reasoning. A denial of certiorari means the court declined to take the case for further review. The practical result was simple. Yancey's convictions remained in place. There is one more part of Tyrie's case that has to be handled differently from the courtroom evidence. The setup allegation. If you search for FSO Gunk online, you will find people who believe Autumn deliberately arranged for Tyrie to come to Lakeside Court while Yancey was waiting. Some use the word backdoor. Others describe the shooting as an ambush. Those claims became part of the public story around Tyrie's death. They are not the same thing as the court record. It is easy to see why suspicion grew. Autumn had dated Yancey during an earlier separation from Tyrie. Tyrie and Autumn reconciled. Years later, Autumn began communicating with Yancey again. Tyrie discovered that communication and moved out. 1 week later, Yancey was in Autumn's bedroom. Tyrie returned to the house. He was shot. Put those facts in a row, and many people will instinctively look for a plan connecting them. There was also strong language in early public reporting about Yancey's presence in the bedroom. Early descriptions can shape how a case is understood long after investigators and courts have developed a fuller record. But suspicion and proof are different things. The official record reviewed for this case does not establish that Autumn and Yancey formed a conspiracy to kill Tyrie. Autumn was not convicted of participating in his death. The jury did not return a finding that she had arranged an ambush, and the prosecution that went to trial against Yancey ended with voluntary manslaughter, not a proven murder conspiracy involving Autumn. That does not mean every question has a clean answer. Why did Tyrie arrive when he did? The public appellate record does not give us a complete answer. Did he know Yancey was in the bedroom before he went upstairs? The record does not clearly establish that. Was Autumn expecting Tyrie at that exact time? The publicly available court opinion does not resolve that in a way that allows us to state it as fact. Did she lure him there as part of a plan to have him killed? The official sources reviewed here do not establish that claim. That is where responsible coverage has to stop. A missing answer is not permission to invent one. And this is especially important when the allegation points toward a living person who was never convicted of the crime. People online are accusing her of planning. You can question the circumstances. You can ask why events lined up the way they did. You can examine what was known and what was not. But saying, "She set him up," requires evidence beyond a suspicious sequence of events. The case already contains enough uncertainty without turning uncertainty into proof. There is another reason to resist that shortcut. Once a setup theory becomes the lens for everything, almost any behavior can be made to support it. If Autumn was emotional after the shooting, someone can call the emotion fake. If she had been calm, someone could call the calm suspicious. Her relationship with Yancey becomes proof. Her communication with Tyree becomes proof. Tyree arriving becomes proof. And eventually, the theory becomes impossible to test because every fact is interpreted in only one direction. A courtroom is supposed to work differently. Claims are challenged. Witnesses are cross-examined. Experts have to explain their limitations. The defense is allowed to attack the state's theory. The state is allowed to attack the defendant's account. And after that process, the documented legal outcome in this case was a manslaughter conviction against Terrance Yancey, not a conspiracy conviction against Autumn Anderson. That distinction does not make the relationship history irrelevant. It makes precision more important. Tyree and Autumn had known each other since they were children. They spent years breaking apart and finding their way back. They became parents. Then the same man Autumn had dated during an earlier separation returned to the picture. Tyree moved out. 7 days later, the three of them were connected to the same bedroom. That is already a tragic sequence. It does not need a fact we cannot prove added to it. The legal case now has an ending, at least as far as the appeals discussed here are concerned. Yancey's convictions survived. The 18-year active sentence remained. But Tyree's life did not begin in June 2022, and it should not end in the telling with a legal citation. He died less than 2 months after his 20th birthday. 20 is an unfinished age. Most people at 20 have not settled into the career they will keep. They have not become the parent they will eventually become. They have not finished changing their minds about relationships, friendships, money, family, or themselves. Tyree never received that time. His adult life stopped while it was still taking shape. His public identity froze with it. FSO Gunk, young father, former boyfriend, homicide victim. Those descriptions are all true. None is enough by itself. His obituary lists family members, not evidence. His music credits preserve the name he used as an artist, not the position of his body in a bedroom. His son carries a connection to him that no verdict can explain. And that is the part the legal system cannot resolve. Courts can decide whether the state proved murder. They can decide whether a jury received the right instructions. They can decide whether evidence should have been admitted. They can decide how many years a conviction carries. They cannot tell Cody what his father would have been like at 30. They cannot return the ordinary days Tyree never got. There is one fact here that stays with me, because it is so small compared with everything that followed. When Tyree moved out, some of his clothes and shoes were still in the house. That is what a breakup can look like when it is only days old. Not a clean line. Not a life packed into boxes and removed. Part of you is gone. Part of you is still there. 7 days later, Tyree came back. According to prosecutors, he wanted to reconcile. He entered a house he knew. He went upstairs. He came through the bedroom doorway. Terrance Yancey fired 16 rounds. Then the case spent years asking what Yancey believed during those seconds. The jury gave its answer in legal terms. Not murder. Voluntary manslaughter. The appellate court let that judgment stand. Maryland's highest court declined further review. And the set-up theory that spread online remains what it was. An allegation the official record reviewed here does not establish. So, if you take one thing from Tyrie Richardson's case, let it be the difference between a question and an answer. There are questions here. Some are uncomfortable. Some may never be resolved by the public record. But the facts we do have are serious enough to stand on their own. Tyree was 20 years old. He was a father. He made music as FSO Gunk. He had spent years with Autumn Anderson. 1 week after their latest breakup, he returned to the house where she was with Terrance Yancey. He never left alive. And if you think the jury drew the line in the wrong place between murder, fear, and excessive force, tell me where you would have drawn it. The point is not to agree with everyone else. The point is to explain which fact changes the case for you. There is another reason the verdict deserves careful attention. A murder acquittal can sound, in conversation, like the jury decided the shooting was acceptable. That is not what happened. Yancey left court with a homicide conviction. The word attached to it was manslaughter, and the distinction rested on the level of criminal responsibility the jurors believed the state had proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That matters because the emotional question and the legal question are different. A family can believe a sentence is too short. Viewers can believe 16 shots should have produced a murder conviction. The jury still had to work inside the instructions it received, not inside the reaction the case creates when reduced to one sentence. And that is why the strongest fact in this story may not be the number of rounds at all. It may be the amount of uncertainty compressed into the seconds before them. Autumn did not see the encounter begin. Yancey was the person claiming to know what he saw. The physical evidence showed movement, but could not put every shot in order. Tyree could no longer give his account. The jury had to build a legal conclusion from what remained. They did. People are still arguing about it, and the passage of time has not made that disagreement any simpler. For Cody, though, there is no legal category that changes the central fact. Whatever the jury called the killing, his father was gone before he was old enough to understand why courtrooms would spend years talking about him. And that is the distance between a verdict and a loss. One can be argued, appealed, and defined. The other simply becomes part of a child's life forever afterward. Tyrie Richardson should not be remembered only as the young man at the other end of 16 gunshots. Before the crime scene photographs, before the trial transcripts, and before strangers argued about him online, he had a life already in progress. His name was Tyree Richardson. His son called him Dad, and people knew his music as FSO Gunk. If you value true crime documentaries that separate the evidence from the rumor and give the victim more space than the speculation, subscribe for the next case.